And record stores are coming back.
They are coming back.
Why did I throw away all that vinyl?
They did ask one time about the Rotary Phone.
Let me invite you to let's reconvene. And what I want to do is I want to start with some questions. You had a moment there at the end of that first session, and one of the things that Michael said that maybe there's something you want to know more about. And I'll do this at each session. By the way, someone said we have to listen to you 2 more hours, and now that hurt my feelings because it's 3 more hours. Yes. Listening to me is like practice for eternity. You think it's been hours and hours. It's just been a few minutes. But we're ahead by a touchdown, and so right now I'm feeling pretty good. Hopeful. See, hopeful. We intercepted the first drive after the halftime, so anyway, so we're dominating except it's the scoreboard. I mean, all right. So what I want to do is take some questions. Let's take about 3 or 4, and if you'll put it in the form of a question, that'll really help us all get in on. I'm sure there's a lot. There's backstory to every question, but just kind of get to the question. That'll help us. What do you got? Yes, sir.
I'm a board member. And so
okay, George, good. Is there someone else with a question?
And one of the things I look at is I'm looking at, I look at monthly financial reports, and I'm looking at salaries and, debt payments and this kind of stuff.
Church
and I don't want to be stuck in that model.
Yes.
So I've got this thing, kind of the old model that I want to change. How do I change that?
Could y'all hear what George is saying? No. He said this is the best seminar he has ever attended. That's just what I was hearing. All right, so George's question was, because he's an elder, board member, maybe not an elder, but board member, and he says, how do we change the stuff that consumes the board? Church, all that. Everybody I do hand-to-hand combat with, and I consult on a personal level, we deal with this issue of changing and I'll get to this down, if you can remember this far down, the scoreboard and the stewardship. We actually shift the agenda of leadership meetings. Until the leadership focuses on different stuff, we're not going to get different results. So I say start with the community stuff. And then if you got any time left over, figure out what to do with the air conditioners not working on the 3rd floor and all that kind of stuff. It just consumes us. And so, for instance, you say, well, how do I do it? Well, if I were consulting you, I would say, let's make it go, how often do y'all meet? Once a month? Once a month. At least every other month, I would have a community leader in to give some kind of insight into what's going on in their world. High school guidance counselor, city council person, the sheriff, police officer, social worker, hospital minister. I would schedule those folks out, and I would have them come in to talk to just about, and that's one way we begin to. In fact, when I even suggest that we do that in our gatherings on Sunday, that once a quarter at a minimum, all the folks I work with, and like I say, on a consulting basis, we get some community leader that we bring in, let them talk about what's going on. I mean, my tribe taught me to come into a worship service and pray that God would dim our vision of what's going on out there, and so we could just focus on Him. And I'm just thinking how God must have been just turning, flips over that. Are you kidding? I wanted you to look at the world. You know, I want you to look at the world. That's the only reason you're there. You got all of eternity to stare at me. Right now, I want you looking at the world. So, anyway. So, I think bringing people in from the outside helps. The other thing that I ask some boards to do is for them to pick a project to work on together outside the church. And it may be outside the church. It may be as simple as, being part of the reading team or the mentoring team, or maybe something, and it depends on the board and their interests, the constituency. But the worst thing we can do is not change. In fact, we're not going to change until we change the scorecard, which means then the leadership agenda, and that's what I mean by stewardship. What do we think we're here for? In fact, Jesus didn't invent a word. We all know this. Church was a well-known word. However, we spiritualize that sucker in all of our seminary training and all the called out, ecclesia and all that, the called out, and just made it like we were just called out, but for what? So if you go back to the first century and you do two pieces of exegesis around first century Judaism about the passage where Jesus gives the keys, establishes the church and keys to the kingdom and all that stuff, binding and loosing, you'll discover there are two pieces in there that change the whole way that we've looked at this. One is, keys are not keys like you and I think about. Locking, unlocking, and part of the reason that got in is because he talks about binding and loosing. All of that was rabbinical language that in the first century they totally got, because they were in a rabbinical group following Rabbi Jesus. And so, traveling rabbi groups were not weird in the first century. It was a primary way. So Jesus gathered his, and when a rabbi thought that his disciples got the message that he was, teaching, that he would give them his key, which was his insignia. And so if you ran into a disciple of Hillel, Shammai, whoever, you knew from the key they were carrying what school of thought, which rabbi they had studied under. Now, does that make sense all of a sudden? Does that penny drop for us? What was Jesus obsessed over? Rabbi Jesus obsessed over the kingdom. So when he says, I'm going to give you keys of the kingdom, that was his insignia. Because Pete had answered the question, right? The final exam, who do you say I am? Good. So I'm going to give you now my insignia, keys of my key, which is the kingdom. Because that's all Jesus talked about. Because let's face it, that's the world Jesus came from. And it was the world he was trying to establish here. Pray that the kingdom would come on earth, just like it is in heaven. I mean, all that stuff it just all ties together once we get the whole point of it. The second thing is, what did the ecclesia, when he says, so I'm going to build my church so you can look after the. In the first century, an ecclesia was the most common use of that was a town council of folks who had responsibility for the community. So when the ecclesia met, what kind of ecclesia would meet and post? We had a great ecclesia meeting. Now, the community's going to hell in a handbasket, but we had a great ecclesia meeting. It was just fabulous. I mean, are you kidding? Their whole job was to look after the town. Wow. We were given that job. That's why when we got siloed and we decided we would just be spiritual leaders, what we did is we diminished our vision to the point that, frankly, we became unusable in many ways, for God to and that's why people outside the church, they clean this board. It's a magnificent board. And you just can't. So I have to honor those efforts.
Thank you.
I have to honor those efforts with something. And this is one question I'm still working off of, isn't it? All we need is 2 more questions and we can go to lunch. That's the way I'm looking at it. So here's a very sophisticated view of your community. This is, so you got the political arena, you've got education, you've got healthcare, you've got arts, you've got business. I mean, you've got to pity on how many slice and dice, up to 14 of these. So what did the church do? We came and we built our own silo. And we just thought, you know, if we'll get this right, I mean, just checking the score, and I mean, 2 ads popped up on my phone during the break. People promising how to do church better. I mean, I'm so tired of it, it's just sick of it. Well, the idea was if we'll get the church fixed and get it right, then they'll flood over here, you know, and they'll fill up our silo. Are you kidding? Of course, in my tribe, we launched missiles out of our silo. That's what we call our silo. You know, and like I said, we took on visiting everybody. You know. I think the perfect storm would have been for C.S. Lewis trilogy to come out, you know, while we were boycotting Disney. Anyway, whatever, what was it, A Lion Wish, or what was it, Narnia Chronicles, that would have been the perfect storm. Anyway, so, but here's my point. And the assumption was if we get the church fixed, and if we get it right, finally figure out the right music, finally get good coffee in the church. It took a while. We you know, up here, y'all pioneered this over on the West Coast. If we just get, you know, figure out the right, are you kidding? Then they'll, are you kidding? I speak in these big old honking Six Flags Over Jesus places all the time. And I'm not against them, it just sounds like it. But the truth is, gang, if building great churches was going to do it, if having great programs was going to do it, it would have already done it. Yes. We spent $100 billion on the church the last few years per year. I mean, it's shrinking for the first time. The money is shrinking because the folks that are giving it are dying, and they're not all writing checks, you know, and the ones coming in at the bottom of the barrel are not willing to write to institutions. And so all that's shifting. And again, it's God's great gift when He cuts off the supply lines and we have to actually pay attention to what's going on out there. You know, it's a gift to us. Don't ask me to do that, but you know, but what we've got to understand. Do you realize what you walked over to come into this room? What's in the floor? Did you read it? What did it say? Established so and so. I know, but what did it say right above that?
Equipping believers for divine appointment.
All right, well, you should know this. You got a leg up on us. So, Pastor, tell us again what's there.
Equipping believers
for divine deployment. You see, kingdom-minded people understand the church is already deployed across all these domains.
I feel like standing up.
They're already there. Nobody else can even think like this, and we're already there.
Yes.
And it's about releasing Jesus followers to be viral in right where they already are.
Come on.
Right.
That's a book proposal right now that I've got going. And if you on Facebook, any of you try to get this book, I'll sue your pants off. Let's just be clear about that. Notwithstanding James, I will haul your butt to court. James's epistle was straw anyway, it doesn't even count. So our main job is to, I mean, in people of a movement, it's about going viral. Because ordinary Jesus followers do change the world for good. Not can, they already are. We've got to tell this story. This is making you believe all this. When people come to church, it ought to help them believe all over again. Instead of believing we can't all over again. And we're in a funk around this because God doesn't have to show up and show off to pull off church. But if we tell the stories of God showing up and showing off in my classroom and in, at the hospital and in my business and stuff like that, and we begin to hear that, then people say, holy cow, Jesus does live.
Yes.
He really does. And this is it. But most of the time we come and we listen to someone give a predigested message that chewed all the nutrients out of it. And we're going to share, not you pastors, I'm talking about other pastors. But no wonder people are bored out of their minds. I mean, not you aren't, but anyway. So, well, whatever the question was, that's my answer.
That's good. Got it covered.
Somebody else had a question, I guess. I don't know. Maybe not. Maybe you now have cowed you down where you don't dare ask a question with that kind of response. What else would you, out of our first time, out of our first session? Emily, you want to ask something?
Church where people are.
Sorry?
Church where people are was what resonated with me. And I think you kind of just went over it with your silos.
Yeah, where people already, so okay, all right. So here's the answer I'm going to give to the question you meant to ask. It was bubbly, it was on the froth of your lips. Couldn't quite escape. What I'm talking about is we've had for the last 1,700 years, we've had one modality in the Western church for the expression of the church. That's the congregational modality. It wasn't even the first life form in the Christian taxonomy of the church. When the church made its biggest move in history, those first few centuries, we didn't even have congregational life form till we settled down and set up shop. What was the life form? Well, yeah, but I mean, literally, what was the expression of church in the Roman world? I'm not asking but let me tell you, I'm going to give you all the right answer, then y'all change the question. It was house church. I'm talking about the form of church was house church. Well, a lot of these village churches that we're talking about, that Jim's talking about in IGL, India Gospel League and all, they're about the size of those early house church expressions in the Mediterranean world that Paul said and all that. Now, this is not a pitch that you disband and go to house churches. Don't hear what I'm not saying. Although, you could probably, there's not a single congregation in this room that couldn't have under your umbrella of ministry multiple expressions of church. Amen. Including community, missional communities, house churches, storefront, all kinds of. So,
you're speaking to us.
Well, it was your question. You get to laugh. I mean, it was your question. So, this doesn't work. So, I'm a little nervous, this crowd over here now. Just don't listen anymore. So, let me tell you, some of the expression of the church I'm seeing, and let me tell you, in this movement, we're going to have to expand the bandwidth of how we think church expresses itself. Over the last 500 years, we've been so busy trying to get the church defined just right, and who can do what, and when, and can they wear a skirt, and can, and how many people have to be together, and all this kind of stuff, and it's consumed us. Yeah. And of course, all the time showing why our form's better than the one down the street and all that kind of. We've been picking each other apart how we're different from each other, and so that's what. And we've even adopted language like a church. A church? There's the church. I don't know about a church. See, when these church planners come up, I think God's called me to plant a church. I usually say, I doubt it. Just to mess with them a little bit. But I said, now, if you want to plant the church, I'm all in. But if you want to plant a church, you know what that means? I'm going to go out and start a worship service somewhere and hope a church grows up around it. A congregation grows up. I mean, it's just the same old stuff, and we're going to get consumed. Spend 90% of our stuff so when you have halftime. So, but if we plant the church, it's going to look like coffee shop, it's going to look like business, it's going to look like restaurant, and I'm telling you, these are things I've already seen. Go to Deep Ellum. Well, you don't have to, I'll tell you that, it's in Dallas. So you don't have to make the trip. All of Dallas is a fun place. up there northwest part of right across. Anyway, so Deep Ellum was a part of town that a politician said, it's so bad now in Deep Ellum, there's no life left in Deep Ellum. That's one of the city council members about 20 years ago, 10 years ago. Well, a couple heard that and said, I don't believe that, because God's in Deep Ellum, so there's life in Deep Ellum. Go to their site has on the side of their wall, life in Deep Ellum. It doesn't say Deep Ellum Church. Life in Deep Ellum. Now that's kingdom language. And by the way, Sam's, their life center, when Jim and I dedicated a life center, it wasn't a church building. It was a life center in that village. And it was dedicated to God and to the use of the village. In North America, we dedicate it to God and to our use. And we usually have a policy manual thicker than the foundation of whatever we're dedicated, on how to keep the community out of our building. We're very good at this. It's just crazy. Well, they didn't pay for it. All of that's proof that Jesus had limited knowledge, or he would not have stayed on the cross. I'm certain of it. I'm not dying for that. Anyway, so, okay. All right. Yeah, y'all fight me about that too. All right. I used to get hate email for it. This is why I'm more encouraged now. It takes a few days now for the stuff to it. I used to get it by the time I got to the airport. All right, so life in Deep Ellum, if you go there, it's a 7-day-a-week operation. It's a coffee shop. And I mean a real coffee shop, not a coffee shop for people that need the caffeine to stay awake during the church service. And, it's a real coffee shop. And it's a real art gallery. And I mean, some of the art is not Sunday school approved. But there are certain things that, they have one of their staff roles is staff, curator, art curator. They have art shows all the time because it's a budding artsy place now. And they have a music venue that operates all week long because that's what's going on in Deep Ellum with some of the stuff. And by the way, Jesus followers use it on Sunday morning together and have a worship service. They also have shared business space in their facility. They have rented business space in their facility. In fact, I went there with an architect who offices at it, who is a Jesus follower. And he's an architect, and he offices there on purpose. So when people come to see him, they can go through the art show and the coffee shop, and he can talk about what the place, because anyone would say, what is this place? What it is a community development center that is also being used by a group of Jesus followers. And they've broken the code, by the way, on how to pay for the sucker. Most churches see the reason we're limited to that scarcity mentality again. We think, well, how much offering is it going to take to keep this? They have figured out by renting space and actually serving the community, more people will actually pay for it because it's actually helpful. And they're not limited then in what they can do with, the stuff. And by the way, when I went to lunch with the pastor, when we stepped out of the building on the backside, the first 3 homeless people we met on our 2-block walk over he knew by name. And so, it's embedded in the community. It would be impossible to imagine a scorecard, if you can remember that word up here, space has a memory. It would be impossible to take that same scorecard, though, mass standardized, and lay it over on top of you. Everyone will ask me, what's the new scorecard? There is no one. You have to get in there and figure out what has God called you to have by way of impact in this community. By the way, as the body of Christ, which one of the first things, I'm trying to say everything I can't say, but how many sentences are open right now? Once you engage the community, I mean, this line of folks that was out here this morning when I pulled up, Pastor, what was this? What were they in line for?
Third Saturday food hour.
Food, okay. Now, so you've taken on food challenge, among other things here, I realize that. All right, anything you take on is a big project. One of the first things you realize is, we can't lift this by ourselves. Wouldn't it be just like God to build it into the equation to make us be susceptible to building partnerships? Because that's what the whole dang thing's about. God lives in community. The kingdom is a community. And he wants us to reflect that community. So why do we have all of these churches? Why is it the church? And so any Pacific Coast, whatever y'all are calling this, C4, isn't that an explosive? Is that intentional? People, use that? I mean, I just was thinking about that. These people are going to be hauled off. How will you become that dangerous, So any move out is going to have to be a collaborative expression, or it can't just be a Church of God thing.
Yeah.
It can't just be a church thing. It's got to be the church. And that's not a criticism. That's an observation. And that's because I know what's in the heart of this yearning to. All right, so the church needs to look different, so that people think it is different.
Right.
So that's what I'm saying. Oh, and by the way, if you need some other models, churches, restaurants, one of my favorite ones that's emerging. I love that. Jesus does too. He loves to eat. And that WWJD bracelet. Just what would Jesus drink? And I know in y'all's movement, y'all are kind of wide open to that. Anyway, so I don't know if y'all just will have to get with it. You just can't. I was grew up Baptist, so I make it up for a lost time. All right, I don't talk about this anymore. And don't write me on that. I'm right. All right, so churches, go to Brood Restaurant though. Do you know how few people in the hospitality industry have been impacted by the gospel in this country? Do you know we're counting on them not coming to church? You do know that. We'd starve to death on our way home. Or we don't want them to shut down the hotel that has our guest speaker in it. I live in the hospitality industry. Their lifestyle, their rhythms. See, it's about people's rhythms. They don't match congregational rhythm anymore. And even most people in your congregations, it doesn't match their rhythms anymore. That's why they're there 1.7 times a month and they're your faithful core. So there's a different rhythm we got to figure out here, kangaroos. But as long as the scorecard is a weekly gathering of folks that we're able to cobble together, and that's our big drive, we'll never be able to figure those rhythms out. We'll keep trying to take people and force them into our template. And I thought we did that in Acts. I thought we got over that in Acts 15, but apparently not. Let's see, church's business. So go up to the Brochies. They're a Pacific family. Washington State. They have the biggest, they just sold it. I think this is public.
Oh, it is now.
They're coming to your house, I'm telling you, all the police. Shut off your computer right now. You have time, but hurry. So the Brochies have the largest orchards, apple orchard. It stretches from Canada all the way through California, Washington State, all the way down. I mean, it's the biggest in the northern hemisphere, maybe the world. They employ thousands of workers, mostly migrant. The Brochies live off of, I think I can say 10% of what they make. And 90% of it is turned right back in to building homes for folks that are migrant workers in schools and communities. I mean, and they'll tell you, this is our church. See, that's business as church. You start the business with the idea that, we're going to bless. I mean, that was back in the day when capitalism actually started, that was part of it. The whole, before, obscene difference between CEO salaries, it was to create and share wealth so people could have a way up and a way out. and they live it out. I mean, and we've got to see more of that if we're going to be in every nook and cranny of our culture. We're going to have to think of how the church expresses itself as a business. Now, I'm not talking about the Christian Yellow Pages. You know, where we, you know, there's no such thing as a Christian computer. But, and all that stuff where we're just servicing each other as kind of a club thing. I'm talking about, honestly, starts, like when Joey started, his wait staff is weighted toward Jesus followers. And by the way, the atmosphere in there, you go in there, Joey, by the way, he's not Pentecostal. He's normal. I don't know how to say that. I don't mean that. I love Pentecostals. I'm just nervous because you got part of God we didn't. So, can you imagine what you're going to reap from this? Why would you do this? It just makes a guy like me want to dance a little bit. I can't help myself. Instead of being safe, I just get edgy. I'm really not even edgy until someone cuts on the camera. So, what was I talking about? Restaurant. Yeah. So Joey, so you go and brood, and you win, and he asked for the worst part of town. And they unshuttered an old warehouse space down there and renovated it, and now it's a thriving business to the point that the city of Fort Worth, I mean, it's sparked a renaissance down an entire corridor that was boarded up and drug infested and gang, you know, and all that kind of stuff where no one wanted to go, because that's what happens when you take back what Elvis stole.
Yeah.
It's a physical example of exactly what you guys talked about. And so what, you go in there, there's sitting areas everywhere, there are Bibles around, and there's scripture or something. I mean, it sounds cheesy. It is not cheesy. I'm telling you. And the food's fabulous. If you're going to do church's restaurant, by golly, it better be. And food's fabulous, very, you know, but by having so many wait staff that are tilted toward being Jesus followers as a formula and stuff, what happens is wait staff folks get a job there and they become Jesus followers. Because they're hanging out with other Jesus followers in their industry, in their rhythm, in their world, 24/7. People who can actually carry on conversations instead of, well, come to our church Sunday. We're talking about that. You know, God conversations. We see what's different from Europe with us right now is we're not secular yet. You can still have a God conversation in America with people, with many people. They're wide open to, particularly if you approach it. Now, not a church conversation. That's dead on arrival. But a God conversation. I was down in San Francisco, you know, the Bible Belt, Buffalo Bible Belt. And Italian restaurant. Late, 9:30ish, flown in, late dinner. Pastor and I was doing some consulting for. And so there was us and one other table. We just engaged the waitress a little bit. And then Gary said, we're going to have a blessing in a minute for our food. So how can we pray for you? Just open-ended question. I do it. You do it. I don't do it every time, but if the Spirit pinches you to do it, you do it. And I've never had a waiter throw the tray down, and I'm going to call ACLU or throw you out. I've never, no. I've had waiters that sit down. I've had them say, like she did, let me go deal with this, close out this deal, I'll be right back. And so she comes up and she says, my boyfriend and I, of course, we told her, as soon as she said that, y'all live together? And, you know, and once we established the rules, God couldn't bless her. So she straightened up. It's clear biblical stuff. So they have a child together and all that, and they've been together for 7 years, and, you know, trying it out still. And she said, my boyfriend's real close to his grandmama, he died last week. She died last week. And last night I went to bed before he did. He stayed up and watched some TV, and he came in the bedroom. He'd been watching Joel Osteen. And he said, I know what I need. I need God in my life. Now, for those of you who saw Joel, I'm saying there's not been a better time for more people to hear and more people to be open. And her question to us was, what can I say to it? I said, take it, Pastor, I'm a consultant. You're the pro. And so, now, that feels like, and by the way, it wasn't just a drive-by shooting, because that pastor followed up, and then of course, they got a job and moved to another part of the country. But the point is, in a kingdom mentality, I just think we're going to have to start celebrating those kinds of conversations. In fact, you can actually even ask your folks how many conversations, God conversations, have you had this week with neighbors. Our conversion rates are never going to go up till our God conversations go up. I can promise you that. So, in a kingdom worldview, you don't have to be all sweaty palm that you got to close the deal.
Yes, that's good.
Because that's what people smell from another zip code, and that's what they feel. Like you're selling Jesus to me, and you're trying to put a sale on it. Instead of, you just let the Spirit work. You don't know what part of their journey you may be the first one to be dropping the seed. You may be at the end of the journey. I don't know. But it's way more fun than feeling like the world I grew up in, where you can be as nice as you want to, and you can talk to people all you want, but it don't count till you club it and head and drag it to church and throw it in a pew. Because, that's the only thing we know you're serious about this, and whether or not they're committed or not. See how old that feels? And no one wants to sign up for that. But how about we celebrate? And that's what I mean by scorecard. And that's the pitch I'm on, by the way, in case you hadn't noticed it. I'm just giving you different scorecard ideas for how you can, basically, what you celebrate when you come together is your scorecard, is what I'm saying. Everybody knows what your church's scorecard is if you don't. If you claim you don't. Most folks will tell you what their church scorecard is how many people, how much money, and all that kind of stuff. How big the building and whatever. And guess what? I'm not saying you're going to quit counting people, and you're going to quit counting money, and you're not going to care about. I'm talking about expanding the bandwidth and what we celebrate when we come together. Most of the time, I'll give you an example. Here's something you do. So a friend of mine lives in Kansas City, and he's trying to make this point about the deployed, since that's something that is right here, that we've all walked over to come in this room. How do you deploy? How do you celebrate their deployment? Because if when we come together, all we talk about is the gifts that it takes to pull off this meeting, then people really don't believe we're celebrating their deployment. They think we're only celebrating if I'm lending my gifts into what it takes to pull off halftime. So what my friend does is, and he does this not as often as I wish, he does it every 3 weeks. I wish he'd do it more often. He has a part of his service called 24 Hours From Now. And he calls up somebody. This is not random. They're not terrified by it. They know ahead of time. And he says, Sal, where are you going to be 24 hours from now? Well, I'm going to be in a real estate office or at home, or I'm going to be teaching or whatever. So wherever Sal's going to be. And he says, and he has a few questions like, what are some of the big challenges you face? Or where do you see God at work? And stuff like that. Now, look what that does. And then, by the way, as soon as he's finishing interviewing her, he asks everybody who's a teacher or real estate or whatever to stand up in the ground and say, I'm going to pray that God will, and he just went down. Look what that does.
Beautiful.
That says the game's out there. We've got it. We're in here so you can play a better game out there. And by the way, that's why coming here is really important. It will help you play it. You see, I'm not saying don't. This is what's going to enable you to have a better game plan, all that kind of stuff. But it celebrates it. Or what I like what Mike Frost does in Sydney. Every week they ordain somebody in the ministry. Now, they call them up. Again, they're not spooked by this. They know what's happening. And this congregation's not thousands. I mean, it's a Sydney, Australia. It's a smaller, several hundred, maybe 200, 300. But he'll call them up and they call out their gifts. They acknowledge the impact this person's had in their life. They lay hands on them and pray that God will use them where he has them deployed already.
That's really good.
See? And Frosty told me, he said, people accuse me all of trying to abolish the clergy. He says, I'm really trying to abolish the laity.
Yeah, that's good.
I just think that's brilliant.
Yeah.
And by the way, since we're on, isn't that a wow? Now, since we're using kingdom and throwing that around, can I remind you of another storyline in the scripture that's pretty, and that's about a kingdom of priests.
I'll preach it.
Exodus 19,
Yep.
1 Peter 2, 5 and 9, Revelation 4, Revelation 5. I mean, there's a storyline there about God's people, a royal priesthood, and you're going to be a kingdom of priests. Oh my gosh. In other words, that's the whole point of the kingdom is to be viral agents, if you want to use. We've got to declergify that language so that our people can get it. So just talk about being viral or something like that. But you write it down. I'm telling you, that's my title. All right. So, what other? Was there another question? While I'm talking about scorecard, before we get to eat here in about another 17 minutes. Yes, sir.
Could you say something about training and equipping?
Would I say something about training and equipment?
Yeah, you see a lot of programs, you see a lot of things happening that don't seem to work.
Yes, you're right.
And sometimes wonder where the Holy Spirit is and all that.
Well, here's what I would say, since I really don't know anything about your question. But it doesn't prevent me from speaking. Because after all, I'm a consultant. And I'm just here to build in the return visit. You're not ready for that yet. Our discipleship, which is what you're after,
Yes,
the storyline's got to change in that. If you want to change your disciples, you got to go through the same 3 things. Right now, the storyline of discipleship in the American church is building customers. We develop customers. I was at a consult. I said, let's open up your website. There were 2 stories there on the homepage about why they belong at this church. God got mentioned once out of the 2 stories, Jesus not at all. See, this is not a church of God because Jesus is the subject of the church of God. But what they did talk about was the great valet parking and the good food and and how good the music was and all. I mean, I heard and what I realized, these were satisfied customers giving you the pitch, just like, selling pet pickup stuff, same old stuff. Why in the world? So we've got to change the storyline into making people actually Jesus followers. And that's what I like about the language that you're developing, and that's going to make its way into your tribe about hanging out with Jesus and being with Jesus, becoming like Jesus, and doing what Jesus does. Because he said, remember, at the end of the Good Samaritan story, go and think likewise. No. Go and do. Right. And so, just do what I do. We don't believe that. I mean, you do. I don't believe that. Really? You do what Jesus did. You offer to pray for the sick that they get well. You offer to represent somebody in the face of take up somebody's side when everybody's yelling they be persecuted, punished? Really? So, I don't believe that. Y'all can if you want to. But see, what you're talking about is a storyline that moves from building great customers to building transformed people. In transformation, yeah, I took a group that was looking at redoing their story in their discipling approach. I took them to oh gosh, what is that box? It's a physical thing, CrossFit box, I think they call it, is it a box? CrossFit place, and I had them talk to a trainer. Any of you do CrossFit before I begin to talk about this? All right, obviously I'm a disciple. But my point was, people's lives are transformed in that box. Why? So I began to just have them figure out what are the elements that people, same thing, you could do the same thing with AA, same thing with Weight Watchers. Look at transformative cultures and environments and figure out what the elements of transformation are. Oh, and by the way, I can tell you, just to steal the most significant thing we know now about transformation is that people need to be in a safe, supportive community for 2 to 4 years. This is true in alcohol and drug rehab. This is true across the board. This is why my friend Larry James, who's building homes for the homeless, talk about a scorecard. Larry will tell you, we have discovered the cure for homelessness is to give people a home. What kind of crazy thing is that? I mean, it's crazy. So over 2,500 people have a home that didn't before Larry thought about it. And the last community he builds communities. Because no one does this by himself. It's for folks that have a drug problem and a prison record. 50 tiny homes and built as a community. Because if they're going to make it, it's going to take living in that kind of environment. Well, we can't approximate transformation in the Church of God or the Assemblies of God or the Godless Baptist or whatever. If Sunday school is a program, we go and we sit there like members and then we're out of here. It requires an actual safe place of actually belonging to people, not just participating as club members. And so I think we're going to see a very different kind of discipling when we move into hanging out with Jesus, becoming like Jesus. But I would tell your denomination, those will only be words unless you develop a delivery system for people to know how to do that. Because they don't know how. And by the way, most pastors do not disciple people because most pastors have never been discipled.
Yep.
This is just the truth. We've documented this across decades. We don't disciple people in America, and yet that was the Great Commission. Well, we'll get around to it after we build this great kingdom. We'll get around to it. And if people just hang out here long enough, they'll catch some of it. Well, some of them do. But the return on investment we find is pretty limited. I don't know if that answers your question, but let me say some other things that I really wanted to talk about.
I just confuse you if I ask another question.
No, that's right. No. Well, because let me just say this too. We've got to turn the family. Families come in all shapes and sizes, but churches have a lot of families. But we don't. Our first thought about discipling should be, what is the family doing in spiritual formation? But what we've done in the program church is we've said, bring us your family. We'll disciple them and we'll hand them back to you. We sure are. We're handing them back in 85, 90% of them, they're out of here as soon as they're out of the program mode. What is wrong with that picture? And so a woman she was in Olympia this week, earlier, like Monday. And she seated over here at a table, and she had a little baby that was 6 weeks old, I think. And, so I was Googling over the baby and all that kind of stuff. She said, yep, this is our newest disciple. And see, that's the way you think. Because mom and dad, every children's ministry person I'm working, every youth person I'm working with, it's about how are you equipping the parents to be spiritual leaders, to have spiritual conversations with their own kids.
Right.
And we haven't done that. We've said we'll have those conversations, like 40 minutes on a week in a world, maybe that worked in a world where the rest of the world reflected the values, but not now, when the rest of the world doesn't reflect those factors and antithetical to your values, and you think a drive-by shooting, or just a squirt gun on Sundays going to do the trick? No, our families have to know how to have spiritual conversations. And by the way, you know now why I don't use PowerPoint, don't you? Not only, it's just because I don't have a thought, but Baylor's done the study on this. For the kids who do stay connected, grounded, the faith, the number one correlation is they served with their parents. Some ministry, some project. Number one correlation. Number two was they served with their peers. So that's why I'm telling congregations, don't do youth trips anymore. Don't do family trips. Hank, in my own community, Hank Shardos, when he went with his 16-year-old, he's Roman Catholic, when he went with his 16-year-old to South America and repair roofs, he came back, retired early, he was so jazzed at the experience, and he started homeworks. And because of the intergenerational nature, and that's the other thing we've got to change the story on. The program church has been so generationally siloed. Well, you can afford that when everybody can come back together around the dinner table at night and all that kind of stuff. That word's not out there anymore, so we better provide intergenerational stuff for mentoring and discipling. Anyway, so Hank was so turned on by the experience that he started homeworks. He helped, he's retired now, he's in his 80s, but he helped over, something like 2,500 people in my town have a roof that doesn't leak, and he used over 20,000 students to pull it off. He would have kids come in spring breaks and Christmas breaks, send whole teams. He would bed them down in church fellowship halls. He'd pray with them at night, pray with the rosary, Roman Catholic, so it's suspect, of course, whether or not it was truly spiritual. And they would work on homes all week, on Monday to Friday, and on Friday night, they would prepare a banquet and invite as the guests of honor the people whose roofs they had fixed. It was so beautiful. He talks about a kingdom picture. And I told Hank that he'd earned, because of his Catholic background, he'd earned 1 second out of purgatory because he was an IRS agent before he retired. So he's got a long time. He won't be there a long time. I mean, he's probably the biggest reason that the earth hadn't, wobbled off its course yet. Waiting for all those years that hangs up. Emily, you had a question.
I was kind of wondering, that kind of tied in with it, because there's a lot of pastors and leaders in this room. So how do we transcribe this idea of to the church, to the people? So it's not just leaders and pastors pushing and doing this work of hey, this is how you have to do it, and they say, awesome, go do it for me, and I'll follow
Right.
behind you.
Yeah, we've not shown transformational power in just aiming at leaders. It sounds good. It doesn't work. Because leaders outside of their systems, if you try to treat a condition outside of its system, all you do is then you just create resistance oftentimes. So it is better to treat this, I would say, in teams, and having multiple people for which I just know as a pastor, me having to deliver all this news is one thing. I go away, I get a great idea, I get jazzed, I go back and the board says, well, that's all fine, but we're $30,000 behind on budget. You're done. All right. So you have to we're going to have to redo how we think about, we're going to have to bring teams of folks together, because that's what it's going to take to change the church culture. Single agent rarely can pull it off. But I can talk more about that later on, maybe. And maybe the Pacific Coast, whatever, the C4 will pick up on some of that. I think that would be a good way to go, actually. Because, by the way, people need to see it, they need to experience, they need to make their own discoveries too. This is another thing we've discovered. When we hand out solutions to people who have not wrestled with a problem, they don't know the why, the what, and the how doesn't mean one thing. They need a real problem, and you don't develop leaders without giving them a challenge, a real life challenge, not a. Again, every leadership school, because leadership over the last 40 years has been such a hot thing, but all of the academic or artificial leadership stuff, it doesn't change leaders. You actually change leaders by giving them real life assignments. And so this is why I think your determination to change the way you look here in the Pacific, on this coast, is such a right idea. Because until leaders do something different, people don't know you're serious. But leaders aren't going to do anything different until the people around them in their system know the why. And they have the language to support it, the story to support it, the scoreboard to support it, and the stewardship. Oh my goodness. Yes, sir. Do you have a question, or were you just
I was
stretching?
scratching my head.
Yeah, well, me too. All right.
I got one if you still got time.
I do, right? And then I want to hand it to you for lunch, because
Great.
I'm completely jazzed about mine. By now, I'm just, all I can think about. Go ahead.
So I've discovered if you've got a group of people who are used to being consumers in the story, and you communicate change to them, that you're called to be producers, a lot of them don't like that.
Yes.
So can you kind of speak to that idea? So if we're going to lead in change, it's difficult because they're used to a certain
Yes, they are.
relationship and dynamic and social contract.
This is such an important question. I want to deal with it when I get to leadership.
Great.
Because managing change and transition, if you're going to take on C4 or 5 or 6 or 3.2, you're going to have to be students of change and how organizational change doesn't sabotage you or what you're, because the system will work to sabotage your change. I mean, everybody that's ever done anything new, you know this.
Yep.
So let's just go ahead and plan for it,
Yeah.
so that we're not caught off guard and we're not always having to fight a rear guard action. And there's some elements to it. It's not rocket science. We actually know some things. And so maybe this afternoon I can talk to some of that. Anybody here? Hear no objection. We're going to lunch.
That's better. Okay.
Oh, it's ready, which
Lunch
is
is,
even more
lunch is ready
important.
to go.
While you pray, I'm going to go eat.
We've got so many pastors here. I'm going to just choose a pastor at random to pray for our lunchtime frame, and then we'll dismiss.
Lord, we just give you thanks for the community of believers. We thank you, Lord, we come together to receive a word of encouragement and instruction. And Lord, we're grateful that we're able to sit together at a table in fellowship. So bless our conversation, bless the food to our body, we pray in your name. Amen.
Amen.
All right, we've got lunch for an hour's time frame. Feel free to continue to have these conversations that we're already having. We'll be back here at the top.
I think there's a lot of questions. Yes. How are we going to respond? I think that's going to be important for producers. Just happen and just go by the wayside.
Go pull up my computer. Tell Dr. McNeal, we have sweet tea. You better get back. You better get back, we got sweet tea.
You're on a lot of